All right, everyone. Welcome to another recording here on American government. We're looking at Chapter 6, Political Socialization. We had a review of polling. Now we're going to be talking about how we reach our viewpoints about politics, the different environmental factors, and we're looking at that from a social perspective that influences how we think about politics and how we approach politics. So this is political socialization, still focusing here on Chapter 6. Okay, so political socialization here with Chapter 6. And this is, again, one of the ways of viewing political socialization is how we learn about politics. So each one of us goes through this experience really on a daily basis. And so you have some parts of your viewpoints about politics that are fixed, fairly strongly in place, but then you have others that are still evolving and changing. And again, that's part of each one of us. So as you can see here in this picture, it suggests that the family structure, which can be different in almost for any one of us, has a considerable influence in how we learn about politics. And so our families are different, so therefore, in many ways, how we view politics will be different. So you can read about family and social networks as part of what we see here in political socialization. But note the transition that's taking place in your lives. For most of you taking this class, because most of you taking this class, you're in the ages of 18 to 20. And as you're in that age, you're in a time in which you're transitioning from the parents being the most influential segment of political socialization in your lives, and now you're having other segments that are having more influence. Probably your friends, maybe your peers at work, other contacts that you have here at the college are going to have more impact on your viewpoints about politics. So consider that in your life, that probably up until maybe the age of 12 or 14, you had a case in which it would be your family that would be the most influential part of your life in terms of just how you viewed the world, would be what mom and dad said or your grandmother said, whatever family member was primarily responsible for taking care of you. And so that was an interesting question asked, when do you get a realistic viewpoint about history? And for some of you, the age was clearly as young as 12. And then for others, perhaps as old as roughly 16. And that really kind of fits that you're roughly in that age is where you start to see people break away from the family and have a different viewpoint about the family, right? If you recall, for many of you, depending on the family how you were raised, you may have looked at mom and dad as really just having the answer to just about everything, right? And then you start to look at mom and dad as human beings, as regular folks. And so sometimes they have the answer, sometimes they don't have the answer, and sometimes they have the wrong answer. And you may start to view that as well. So you see that break that's occurring, and now your friends become more important in your life. And so clearly, this is where the friends that you choose becomes very important. So are you choosing friends that can make you a better person? And I think that can be extremely important. And that's a key part of what's going on in your lives right now. So how you choose your time, how you use your time, and then how you choose your friends. Maybe two factors that just can't be replaced by anything else. So during this transition in your life, certainly make some wise choices there. And they're going to influence your politics as well. As your text mentions on page 217, education becomes extremely important in determining how you view politics. Education is one of the most important factors in predicting who engages in behaviors that increase political knowledge, such as regularly following the news, voting, and participating in politics. So it stands to reason, the more education you have, the more likely you're going to participate in politics. And not just then voting in a presidential election, but voting in all elections, being aware if there's a election dealing with the school, local school, that you're aware of it, you're paying attention to that. So some of these elections can have considerable impact in local government, and you would be aware and paying attention, that you're aware of what's happening beyond just your hometown. You're aware of what's happening throughout the country and around the world. And you read more, you listen more, and then that's just going to be a way in which that has a greater impact. And the more educated you are, the more likely you're going to be an active citizen. As we can see here, there are other social groups and public opinion. There are other factors that influence how we view politics and why we have differences in politics, why we support different candidates, support different viewpoints. And so here's how we can look at some of these other factors. And again, each one of these factors has some impact on your life. I mean, you are of some race, you are of some ethnicity, you are of some gender, you are either active in a religion or you're not. You more than likely are a member of a political party. You may not be, but in most cases you are. You perhaps are part of an economic class, and we'll go into some question about that. And then the events that happen, whether you really were directly involved in that event, will have some impact on your life. Where you are really just the first generation, those again who are taking this class, and you're at the age of 18 to 20, you're the first generation that has not had a direct impact from 9/11. Some of you weren't even born when that happened now, but some of you were just an infant at that point. So it didn't have much impact on your life. You didn't see these images, you didn't see them live, and so it's going to have a different impact on you. But you're seeing other events, certainly COVID, that's having this impact on your personal life and on your what you're wanting to achieve in your education and other activities. And so that's going to have an impact on your politics as well. We're all part of a race. It doesn't have to necessarily define us, but does it have an impact on how other people judge us? So you can say, I have a particular skin color, or I look a certain way, but that doesn't really define who I am. But can you control how other people perceive you? And so that becomes an issue there in which race is a factor. We may not like to think that it is. Maybe we think we're doing the right thing by saying that you as an individual may choose to be colorblind, but other people may consider, is that even possible? I mean, aren't you seeing someone else's color if you see them? And so do you make judgments whether you're fully aware of it or not? And this is a really interesting website called Freakonomics. I would urge you to look this site over. I don't have this as one of the suggested sites. Maybe I should, but it is something that you may find very interesting. And so when you hear people say, well, I just want to judge the individual, not somebody's particular race or background. But Freakonomics and ABC News did a study in which, when it comes to reviewing people's resumes to apply for particular jobs, you had white-sounding names just do better in terms of getting more reviews than black-sounding names. And it's been a couple of years ago now, but I actually had a student, African-American student in my class one summer, got to really know the students pretty well. And he mentioned that he actually had a relative that changed his name so he could have a better opportunity of getting jobs. So our judgments being made, whether we fully recognize that or not. And so the white name versus the black name. And there's also some mention there of the gender gap. You can read about this on page 220. And here's our question for chat. What political issues create the biggest gender gap between men and women? So a gender gap is to say there's a considerable difference between men and women. It's not to say that all women think a certain way, all men do, but fairly consistently you would see a gender gap. So go ahead and write down what you think might create the biggest gender gaps. What political issues create the biggest gender gap between men and women? We'll just have a pause here, and then we'll move on. What we do see here, also in your text and roughly in those same pages, you'll see with religion, the more one goes to church, the more one tends to be conservative. So that's really in some ways viewed as religiosity, not really brought out in your text. That's kind of a more complex issue that's reviewed, dealing with the measurement of religious activity and political identity. But religiosity would say it's not enough to simply say someone says that they're a Christian. Then the question is, well, not necessarily how Christian are you, but how seriously do you take it, right? Do you go to church every Sunday? Do you go to church more than one time a week? Or do you go to church one time a year? Well, does that then mean that there's a considerable difference between people based on their political viewpoints and how seriously they take religion? So the people who are very active within a church tend to be more conservative. Now, one of the questions there can be which horse is dragging the wagon, I guess, in a way, right? Are the churches going to be perhaps more conservative because the conservative people continue to go to church? And so is it the church influencing the people, or are the people influencing the church in that case? And maybe it doesn't really matter, but it does seem to be that tendency. The more people, the more an individual goes to church, the more they are to be conservative. And clearly, as your text mentioned, there is a difference between the two political parties. So when you hear people say, well, there's not a bit of difference between the Republicans and the Democrats, that simply is not true. I mean, when you just look at public opinion polls and how people that are consistently voting Democrat, what they find to be important issues, versus those who are consistently voting Republican and what they find to be important issues. There's stark differences. And so your text mentions, for example, the environment, having government activity to try to find ways to improve the environment. The Democrats are far more likely to support that than Republicans. And so there is a difference with the political parties. And there's also then a view on economic class. This chapter brings out some tough issues, and which, we need to confront those. And that's what we're going to do here on our second question for chat. Want to hear some good input here. Is there a class system in the United States? So is there a class system in the United States? are many people born into a particular economic class, and it is very hard to get out. So if we say, you know, you can work your way out of a class, well, maybe you can, but can most people do that, right? Or is there, in fact, an embedded class system in the United States? Something there for you to look over and consider. Maybe a tough question, but one for you to analyze. And again, your answers can be very helpful for other people here in the class. So would like to see many of you share your thoughts on this question. All right, there we go. So some review on political socialization. And our next subject here in Chapter 6 will deal with political ideology.